For those that missed the last episode of the Ferrari build, we left off on a little bit of a cliffhanger. We aimed to address some of the cooling issues we were facing at the front of the car, mainly dealing with air bubbles that arise from the fact that our coolant lines run through the rockers and then up and over the front wheels, creating high points that have proved to be a challenge to bleed the air out of effectively. Instead of going with an off-the-shelf solution, I decided to buy some raw materials and make something of our own. I turned some aluminum down on the lathe so that we could make an inline -20 bleed port. This was a perfect opportunity to brush up on my aluminum TIG welding skills, so I burned them together, and then we transitioned over to building a coolant expansion tank, because the car didn't have one in its last iteration. By hooking these bleed ports up to this expansion tank, we now have an effective way to fill and bleed the system at the front of the car. But we're not done yet, so let's get back to work. In addition to adding a steam port to the top of each coolant line, I want to add one to the uppermost corner of the radiator as well, because it seems like there's guaranteed to be a bubble here unless we do something about it. The easiest solution is to just add another -4 AN port here and route it to our expansion tank, another avenue for steam to escape and to make sure this entire system is filled with water. For the first time in a while, I had some serious trouble with contamination on this weld. I assume it's due to the fact that I was unable to clean the backside of the aluminum, and I have had coolant run through this radiator at this point. But everything seems to have worked out, and I'm hopeful it's going to seal up just fine. Now for a flashback all the way to one of the very first episodes of the build series when we mounted our CSF Radiator. The crossbar at the front of the car to hold the radiator up was tacked into place, but in that time I have never fully welded it. But with the cooling system empty and the radiator out, what better time than now? So let's knock it out and cross it off the list once and for all. Reaching the lower radiator mount was a bit more of a challenge, but it too is now welded up and the radiator is firmly mounted into place. Now we need to mount our expansion tank, so I opened up Fusion 360 and drew a bracket. Now obviously this could be done with good old-fashioned pen and paper, but once you've learned how to use CAD design software, it makes this process so much more efficient. I drew this bracket up in only a handful of minutes, and then folded it flat and printed it out on the printer. As a result, we have a template that's going to fit, as long as I got all of my measurements right. There's no human error or wiggly lines, and I know that if I copy this template, we're going to have a pretty part when we're done. All we have to do is follow the template to the letter. With the drawing cut out, I mounted it to a sheet of aluminum, traced it out, and then center punched all of the holes that we need to drill. I then stomped it on a shear, and then shaped it using the now working disc sander. I'll selfishly say that if you're enjoying this episode or the build itself, please consider subscribing, because your support helps this channel grow and keeps this project moving forwards. Now we need to drill a large hole in our sheet aluminum, and if you've ever tried to use a hole saw for this process, you know how awful it is. Which is why I'm excited to show you guys some sheet metal hole saws specifically for this purpose. The wider teeth on this bit made by Blair keep the bit from grabbing the metal and potentially damaging it as you're trying to cut it. It also doesn't dance around, and it creates a perfectly finished hole every time. These are one of the most valuable things I've added to the kit in the last number of months. Just try getting a cut that nice with a traditional hole saw, because it ain't gonna happen. Now from this point, I could have used our template to make the side panel, but I decided to freestyle it just a bit because I wanted the panel to wrap around the bottom side to give it a bit more rigidity overall. If this tank is full of water, it could get pretty heavy, and I don't want it to snap off the mount. On that same note, I welded a rib to the back side of the mount to keep it from flexing in any direction. And following that, I inserted the rib nuts into the top side so that we can finally bolt this thing into place. I wouldn't call it my best aluminum welding, but it's definitely good enough for who it's for. Most of it will be invisible in the car anyway, and I think it's going to be plenty strong enough to support this coolant tank as we're hopping curbs at Buttonwillow. Now there is one hurdle left to clear for this tank, and that's that the fiberglass firewall within the Ferrari is going to prevent us from installing it. The tank is just too tall to fit within the space that we have if we want the hood to close, and I think closing the hood is pretty high on the list of priorities. Cutting the hole in the firewall isn't too worrisome because we're only expanding a hole that was already there, and I can come back later at any point and close it up once we get to that point. But for now, I want to make sure that the cooling system is functioning properly, and this is a critical step. With enough vertical height, we can confirm that everything does indeed fit, and now we can move to installing the -20 inline steam ports that we made in the previous episode. The scary part is that requires cutting the coolant lines that are already in place. Hundreds of dollars worth of hose that runs through each side of the car that, if I mess up, would cost a lot to fix. Thankfully, there is some margin for error because we've just got to take about 8 inches out of the middle of each line. Enough to put new fittings into place so that we can section in these steam port fittings. The process is the same for both sides of the car. Cut hose, insert fitting, and then hook the steam port up to the expansion tank. And now not only can air escape the high point of the cooling system, we can also backfill it with water. We now have a functioning cooling system at the front of the car once again. In retrospect, there were a lot of different ways that we could have solved this problem at the front of the car. Some of you guys suggested something like a vacuum bleeder, which I raised some concerns with, and obviously we could have changed our pump setup or rerouted the lines, but honestly, I think this solution works well because it solves multiple problems in one. We can use this setup to bleed the car and to fill it. Because we have a filler neck at the back of the car as well, it should eliminate any problems we have from here on out. Now let's rewind one more time and get up to speed on the current clutch situation. If you missed it, when we were on the dyno, we had some clutch issues causing some surging in the driveline, so we pulled the engine and then took a closer look at what's going on within the transmission. Initially, we assumed that it was a problem based around clearance between the hydraulic release bearing and the fingers of the pressure plate. But once we took a bunch of measurements, we realized that might not be the case. Instead, what we found was that every single spring on both clutch discs was broken. This happened as a result of the fact that the clutch was shipped to us with one of the discs installed backwards, but thankfully Clutchmasters was more than happy to get us set up with 2 brand new unsprung clutch discs, a better suited fit for the transmission that we're using. However, even though I know all of the parts are assembled correctly this time around, I still want to make sure that the clearance for our hydraulic release bearing is perfect. So I spent all day measuring, double-checking, and then triple-checking every measurement possible. Spending all day doing this probably sounds like an exaggeration, but trust me, it wasn't, because the measurements I was getting weren't quite what I wanted to see. You see, the instructions suggest that I should have somewhere between 80 thousandths and 120 thousandths air gap between the release bearing and the fingers of the pressure plate. But the most that I was seeing was somewhere around 20 to 30 thousandths. If we don't have enough gap, we could experience a similar clutch slipping issue to what we had the first time around on the dyno, and I really don't want that. But I called the guys at Clutchmasters and confirmed everything that I was seeing on my end, and they told me, bolt it together and send it. So I'm going to trust them and hope I don't have to go through this whole rigmarole again. I've got one more part to install before we actually drop the engine into place, and that is an upgraded Wasp billet starter. Not only is it lighter than the original unit, it is a work of art in comparison. I feel confident this thing will keep us starting whether we're on the road or on the track, and it's certainly an upgrade from the factory unit. And with that, the engine is finally ready to go back in the car, and believe it or not, this has been an agonizing wait. The past few weeks have felt like an eternity, and it was starting to feel like this might never happen. It was hiccup after hiccup. But here we are, it is actually going back into place, and thankfully Khalil was around to lend a hand. With the engine in, I wanted to go through and give the oil filter housing a thorough cleaning. If we open this thing up, we can actually see all of the particles that have been caught before the oil enters the oil filter. I've showcased this filter housing in several previous episodes, and finally you can see exactly what the screen looks like. Fortunately, pretty much everything caught in this is just rubber particles from when we made our lines, and everything looks to be in pretty good health. It's nothing I wouldn't expect to see on an engine after a first start and partial dyno session. Getting the engine to sit back into place was only the first step in a long list of jobs. Now begins the slow process of installing literally everything else back in the engine bay. To get the engine out, it seems like everything has to come out before it, which means everything from oil lines to the exhaust system, the turbo, the charge piping, the intercooler, every hose, every wire, you name it, it all came out. Thankfully, everything in the car has been out at least half a dozen times at this point, so I know most of it like the back of my hand. The only remaining trick is to remember exactly what order everything does get installed. It's possible to go out of order and find yourself doing and redoing steps over and over. Thankfully, I only misstepped once or twice on the whole reinstallation of all these parts, so we're doing pretty good at this point. That does bring us, though, to our Driveshaft shop 1000 horsepower axles. The passenger side of the car goes into place without a fight. There's enough room to insert it into the car without removing any components. However, if we go to the other side of the car, there's a different story. Step 1 is to get that pesky rotiform ROCH out of the way. Unfortunately, from here, we've got to remove the upper control arm from the chassis in order to swing the knuckle out of place. We need this much room in order to slide the axle both into the transmission and into the splined wheel hub. In all, it's not truly a ton of work, but it definitely makes this side of the car a bit more of a challenge. Next on the list is the car's charge piping, which in the past has been difficult to fit into place. I have to assume that it's just because things move around when you weld them, but this time around, things fit better than ever before, so maybe an R&R on the engine was a good thing. I do have something new to add this time around, and that's a Haltech boost control solenoid. We wouldn't have been able to get really far into the tuning process while we were at the dyno last time without this, but instead of installing it on the fly, now we can do something at least a little bit more streamlined. Instead of having a long pigtail hanging off of this thing, I'd like to mount it somewhere close to where the harness itself terminates. Rywire has our engine harness set up for a Deutsch connector, and thankfully that's exactly what Haltech provides with this kit, so it's more or less plug and play. As for where to mount it, I might be getting a little bit lazy, but there's already a perfect mounting provision for where we have our vacuum regulator for the valve cover. It's up and out of the way of any heat sources, and as said, it lands right where our harness terminates, so I think this is a good spot. It'll look a little bit better once I replumb this with some AN lines later down the line, but this is going to work out great. We are getting closer and closer to the finish line, and now I need to change the end on our starter wiring to a ring terminal so that it can fit our new Wasp starter. I should have done this before I put the intake manifold in, but oh well. And now, with all of our lines tightened up, we can fill the car with oil, only this time we're going to make a change. After talking to the team at Pennzoil, we landed on their Platinum Racing 10W60 formula, which should do an even better job of meeting the insane demands our K24 is going to make. But because this is some special sauce, if you will, it only comes in a 5-gallon bucket, and because I'm not the Hulk, I can't pour this directly into our dry sump tank. So I spent a little bit of time transferring it over to some smaller bottles, and then got to filling our dry sump tank with 2.5 gallons. Due to both the capacity of our oil system and the complexity of the oil itself, I have no doubt that we'll be able to push this car to the absolute limit. With the oil in and the oil system primed, we are finally ready to start this car once more. The final step is to prime the fuel system by turning on the ignition. Dyno time. 1, that smells amazing, and 2, that never gets old. I still get so stoked hearing it run. And I know some of you guys don't like the way that it sounds, but Everyone that's heard it in person so far says it sounds nuts. I can't believe the presence this thing has. So anyways, I think at this point we are ready to go to the dyno. I've got a couple really tiny things that I need to do. I honestly have not put coolant in it yet. So I gotta bleed this whole new system. A couple of little bolts that I need to tighten up, and it's dyno time. Next episode should be, barring any major snags, on the dyno. I've already talked to Andrew. We are ready to go back, and I'm stoked. So I'll see you guys then. Thanks as always for the support. I'll catch you next week. All right, end of the episode thoughts for anybody that made it this far in. I figured I'd add this in at the end for some of that relatability or honesty that some of you guys come to this channel for. The last week or so of working on this car has been maybe one of the most challenging mentally since I got started. A handful of days before Christmas, Emily and I both got sick. She tested positive for COVID. I did not, but who knows what else it could have been. We spent a week out of commission, and then we took our annual kind of Christmas camping trip. We did that. We were gone for another week, and then I came back. I've been trying to get everything back in order, working on the Audi. Honestly, it's been probably 3 weeks since I touched this car, and all I've been looking towards kind of facing when I get back into it is just putting the engine back in the car, having to hook up all of the plumbing, get all the wiring back in, just all this monotonous stuff that's not rewarding that I've done 100 times already that's just work, and I've got to film it all and make it all happen. It's just been a challenge to do. It's just I haven't been motivated, and it's just been a slog, a huge slog. Now I feel better now that it's done, but I wanted to share that because that's how this stuff goes sometimes. I'm not looking for sympathy. I don't need any consolation. I'm sharing because I want you guys that have your own projects out there to know you're not alone in feeling this way. It doesn't matter who you are, how big your project is, how excited you are for the finished product at times. I mean, trust me, I'm looking forward to get this thing over to the dyno. And now that it's all together, that's in the immediate future. I'm excited again. But sometimes those steps that you have to go through while working on your car just suck. There's no two ways about it. And so I figured I'd make sure I iterated that I deal with that in here too. So you're not alone. If you're looking for that motivation to get your project done, as I've said many times before, the only thing you can do is just pick up the tools and force your way through it. No one's going to build your car for you. But I promise if you do that, you'll get your momentum back. I've got mine. Do your best to keep your momentum up too, and I'll catch you up next week. Thanks.